Hi, I'm Susan Swain, host of C-SPAN's Q&A, where we spend an hour with nonfiction writers and historians who add context to today's news. Abraham Lincoln has provided familiar terrain for generations of writers. Historian and Politico contributing writer Joshua Zeitz brings a new angle to Lincoln's story: how his concept of faith and God evolved during the course of the war and following the death of his young son, Willie. This week, we talked to him about his new book, Lincoln's God. He contends that Lincoln's relationship with the country's evangelical movement shaped his views on slavery as the moral cause for the war, and in turn, the evangelicals became powerful political allies for Lincoln. Our conversation will begin in just a moment.
Ow! Those uncomfortable things we do for beauty.
Oof! Ouch!
And when it comes to whiter teeth, same story. Until now. Enjoy rinse-free whitening with new Sensodyne Clinical White. You'll get clinically proven whitening technology in an enamel-safe formula for 2 shades whiter teeth and 24/7 sensitivity protection. Sensodyne Clinical White, a whiter smile without the wince.
South Carolina's economy is growing, bringing new businesses and opportunities. The need for electricity is growing too. At Duke Energy, we're meeting the challenge, providing even more electricity that's reliable, that stays affordable. To do this, we're investing in our communities with a diverse, balanced mix of energy sources and making targeted upgrades to the grid so that South Carolina can thrive in a smarter energy future. Paid for by Duke Energy shareholders.
Joshua Zeitz, your new book is titled Lincoln's God: How Faith Transformed a President and a Nation. I think we both know that there's probably no subject that's been more plumbed than Abraham Lincoln over the centuries here. What is your new angle on him in this book?
I wanted to look at Lincoln and his spiritual journey throughout the 1800s, from the 1820s, 30s through the Civil War, and use that as a way to explore the importance and centrality of religion to the way that Americans, particularly Northerners, perceived the Civil War, understood their role in that war, and made sense of all of the disruption and the carnage and the social change that occurred in that period. And you know, Lincoln, to your point, has been well plumbed. There's precious little you can find about him that hasn't been written on, although oddly enough, his relationship both with religion on a personal level and the churches on a political level is a really important part of his presidency that I think has been underserved. But you know, when you're thinking about Lincoln, he is at both, you know, in both ways, he's sort of an avatar for the 19th century in the United States, but he's also a classic iconoclast. And so looking at him and using him as the narrative pull through for that story seemed to me like it might be a compelling way to go about the topic.
Do you contend that Lincoln's spirituality is important to the course of American history?
Yeah, I think that, you know, Lincoln comes into the presidency as a pretty fervent non-believer, and in his last days, he's something of a believer, although again, in a way that's fairly iconoclastic. And I think that to understand his, well, 2 things: to understand his personal tolerance for the disruption, the pain, the violence that he had to oversee as president, understanding his spiritual journey is helpful and important, but also to understand how Lincoln pulled the North along, got people to at first support the war for Union and then reconceptualize the war as a war to abolish slavery. Religion is central to that because the churches played a huge role in that. People understood that transition through a religious lens, and he proved really deft at marshaling support for the evolving war effort by appealing to churches, by appealing to people's individual spirituality. And so I think that's an important part of that story.
Here's a highly speculative question. Could the war have been won without all of the involvement of the churches that you write about?
I mean, that's highly speculative. I think that what I would say is that the churches, the Northern evangelical Protestant churches, were enormously influential in marshaling support for the war. They did it in material ways. The churches served as staging grounds to raise recruits and enlist recruits. They were the places where recruits gathered and their families gathered for really elaborate ceremonies before they were sent off to war. The churches staffed almost every regiment with chaplains. The churches were enormously influential, increasingly throughout the war, in marshaling political support for the war effort and the administration, and eventually the Republican Party. And the churches also, every Sunday, ministers helped to frame the war and help people make sense of it, make sense of the sacrifices that they were being asked to make. And so I would say, I don't know whether in the absence of the churches, the North could have won the war, but certainly they were widely influential influences. And, it's important to remember, and I think it's easy for Americans of this generation to forget that in the mid and late 19th century, Protestant churches were arguably the sort of largest and most influential building block of civil society. They had enormous sweep. And they had, unparalleled influence. And so the fact that they engaged fully to support that war effort was meaningful.
And how important were the churches to Lincoln's reelection in 1864?
It's one of the most interesting parts of the book, from my perspective, having researched it, is that, in the early and mid 19th century, the churches were enormously influential, but there was a broad understanding that there should be a line between the secular and the sacred, between the churches and state. And so churches, by and large, steered clear of politics. That changed gradually over the course of the war. In the early 1860s, 1861, 1862, the churches are, as you would expect, they're involving themselves on behalf of the country's war effort. They want to be patriotic. They want to frame the war as an important mission to save democratic society. And there had always been this millennial strain in evangelical Protestantism that viewed America as, the new Canaan. And so if you're going to protect, God's, new Canaan, you have to support the war effort. And so, but what's fascinating is that by 1863, 1864, the facts on the ground caused the churches to become entirely more political, because as the Democratic Party, the opposition party, splintered, and you had a kind of so-called war Democrats who supported the administration's war policies, although they were tepid on abolition. But then you had a very large contingent of the Democratic Party, the so-called peace Democrats or Copperheads, who wanted to essentially let the South go its own way or admit the South back with slavery intact. It became very difficult for church leaders to say you could be a good Democrat, be a good Christian, particularly as abolition became a war aim and the churches lined up squarely in favor of it. And so by 1864, the churches actually are quite political, and you have prominent lay and religious leaders actively campaigning for the Republican ticket and for Lincoln's reelection. You have ministers and lay leaders, individual churches, and Presbyterian synods, and Methodist circuits and Baptist associations openly endorsing the Republican ticket, telling people to be a good Christian, you have to vote Republican. So the church has become extremely mobilized on behalf of the Republican Party in '64. Now, could Lincoln have won without their support? Who knows? But he did win with their active and enthusiastic support.
You earlier, penned a biography of Lincoln's two top aides, Nicolay and Hay. I'm wondering whether or not that set the seeds for this book. Did they provide enough information on this topic of Lincoln's spirituality to have you investigate further?
No, very little. John Hay was a sort of irreverent character. I mean, I think he probably went through the motions of pretending to be a pretty good Christian, but I see very little in his, I've read read most of his papers. I don't see much in there to suggest that he was particularly devout. And I think Nicolay, the same. If they were privately so. It wasn't something that was effusive for them. So they didn't leave much record on this, which is interesting. Nicolay later felt that people had exaggerated Lincoln's, personal evolution, spiritual evolution. And I think it's one of those rare moments where Nicolay probably got it wrong. But it strikes me, and it's speculative, but it's probably not something that they discussed at length with him. And the most interesting document in some ways that gives you insight into Lincoln's personal religious evolution was this scrap of paper he wrote, kind of 2 or 3 paragraphs. They later called it Meditations on the Divine Will, in which it's almost, he didn't keep a diary, but it's almost as though it were a lone diary entry. And it was written in 1862, and he's writing to himself and grappling with the question of what God's will was and what God expected of him. But they didn't discover it until after the war, and they seemed as surprised as anyone to find it in his trove of documents. So it doesn't seem likely that he spoke at length with them about it.
As a researcher and a writer, what draws you back to this period?
There are a bunch of things. I mean, I think that in this particular era, like in the era we're living in, there's a great amount of proximity, at least thematically, to the political acrimony and division of the 1850s. And then I find the 1860s and the constitutional and social revolution of the 1860s to be so deeply informative and important to us right now, which is something we could talk about further in this discussion. But as a researcher, one of the things I love about this period is that you can really access people's internal lives. I was trained as a 19th and 20th century American historian, and a lot of my original work was done on 20th century U.S. history, and I'll write on that again and still do. But people wrote letters back then, and they kept diaries, and they gave, you have this portal into people's interior lives. Now, for Lincoln, that is certainly less so, because he was, as he once said of himself, one of the most shut-mouthed men you could possibly meet, or maybe that was his law partner who said that of him. But the people around him were really prolific diarists, and if you take like Nicolai and Hay, they had a lifelong correspondence with each other, which gives us a great deal of insight into the events and actors of that day. But they also just were sparkling writers and conversationalists, and you got a real sense of who they were on a personal level. I think that's lost. People don't write letters anymore, and I'm not even sure how many people write deeply personal emails, and text messages are going to be lost to the ages for the most part. So it'll be really interesting to see how future generations of historians try to get the richness and depth that I can get, or a 19th century historian can get from that era, looking at historical actors today. I think it'll be a real challenge, and it may just be very difficult, if not impossible.
Of course, to be able to understand his evolution, you start with his beginnings, and so I want to spend a little bit of time there. Tell me about Lincoln's birth years, or childhood years, growing up in his life with his parents and in Hardscrabble, Kentucky.
Yeah, so Lincoln's born in Kentucky and then largely raised in southern Indiana, and then when he turns about 20 or so, they move to central Illinois. And his childhood is spent like many of his peers. He's raised by parents who are essentially subsistence farmers. They attempt to farm for the proto market a little bit, but this is a period before the great transportation revolution in the U.S., so there are no really good macadamized roads. There are very few canals by that point. There are certainly no railroads at that point. Bridges, other infrastructure. And so when you think about it, if you're being raised in that environment, you're farming, for subsistence, and you're largely existing in a barter economy, a cashless economy. You could try to farm commercially, but there's nowhere to bring, there's no method to bring your goods to market. Lincoln's father tried it once or twice, and it didn't work because it cost more money to move the goods than he made by selling it. So it's a world that Lincoln didn't like. He growing up at that point, he had broader ambitions, felt that his parents had a sort of constrained set of aspirations and a constrained idea of what one could be in the world. And so the historian Joyce Appleby did a good academic article on this years ago, where she looked at the kind of tension that existed between Lincoln and his father. Was very typical in that age, because Abe Lincoln is straddling two worlds: this world of subsistence farming and extended kinship networks that his father and mother, and then later stepmother, inhabited, and then this burgeoning market economy that's beginning to burst up around him. that offers young men like him who want to be on the make opportunities to do things that didn't involve farming or physical labor, or that enabled them to exist in a market economy and reap the fruits of their ambition. And so I think for him there was this tension and a dissatisfaction with the life that he lived as a young boy and young man, oftentimes bubbled over into a tension with his father, who lived firmly in that world and not in the world that Lincoln would eventually enter as a store clerk, as a surveyor, as a postmaster, as a lawyer and a politician.
I have 2 points I wanted to, before we leave that period. This was a fact that had missed my attention on the many Lincoln things I've read, that his father hired him out for manual labor. And you suggest that this gave him some perspectives on slavery.
Well, that's what people have said. There's that I think that I would say less that it gave him perspectives on slavery, and it gave him more a sense of ownership over one's labor. So, Lincoln chafed under his father's control. In that period, young men weren't permitted to emancipate themselves effectively until they were 21, and so his father was able to lend him out for labor, and the wages would go to his father. And Lincoln found it unjust. There was somebody later said that Lincoln said, or somebody later remembered, and I don't frankly think there's any evidence of it, but that Lincoln said, I'm paraphrasing, but I know what it's like to be a slave because I was a slave for my father. I don't think he said it, but I think that if you look at the way in which he developed his anti-slavery convictions, they were far more rooted in kind of ideas of natural law and free labor and a free labor market than they were in any religious sensibility in the 1840s and 50s. And he firmly believed that people, deserved to benefit from the labor that they did, and that if you earned something through sweat and labor, it was yours, it wasn't someone else's. So I think it probably informed his ideas about that, but I don't think he ever saw himself as having been, in any parallel arrangement to slavery.
One other point from that period, you quote his cousin Sophie, who said that Abraham always had a natural idea he was going to be something.
Yeah, he was ambitious from the start. He was a young man from really constrained circumstances who felt, according to Sophie, and you have to allow for the fact that people's memories were colored after the fact, but it was very clear that he had a burning ambition really young, and that is part of what I think caused him to butt up against his parents. And to that point, his parents were very devout Baptist, hard-shell Baptist or anti-mission Baptist, so they were sort of non-evangelical. They were more predestinarian in their belief set. They were more kind of traditional Calvinists. And Calvinists could be hyper competitive in the marketplace. If you look at Puritans who came from England to what is now New England in the 1600s, these were oftentimes these are people who were extremely involved in the market economy in the UK and in Europe. But the kind of Calvinism that his parents embraced had a sort of fatalism to it. It didn't give a sense that people had agency, personal agency, over their lives or their fate in the next life. And it was a theology that made a lot of sense in a world where you really didn't have a lot of agency over your life. But Lincoln is embracing this vibrant market economy in which personal agency and ambition are thought to be rewarded. And certainly, Sophie's remark, if indeed she said that, because we have to take it on face value, it gives us a kind of a little bit of a window into young Abe Lincoln and what he wanted differently from his life.
So he set out at age 22 to New Salem, Illinois. A description you write of him: he was friendless, uneducated, penniless, and alone in the world for the first time. How did Abraham?
He said that.
It was his words. How did Abraham Lincoln reinvent himself?
Yeah, New Salem is deeply ingrained in Lincoln lore, and he only lived there for about 5 or 6 years. It was this tiny little hamlet, but it was the first proper town he had ever lived in, and it seems to have attracted a kind of quirky, eccentric, and diverse group of people. I'm not sure why, but it was, people liked him. and it was the place where he generally roomed and boarded while he was there. He never owned any property of his own, although he did at one point borrow money to try to buy a store with a friend, and that went bankrupt. But the townspeople sort of took him in. He got there. He was this very strange, lanky kid who was wearing ill-fitting clothes, and but it's there where he met people who got him, taught him how to get really engaged in serious books and taught him how to be a surveyor. It's there where he started to kind of study the law, and it's there where he first ran for the legislature. First time he lost, second time he won, but it gave him the confidence and the lift, and it gave him a pathway to break free of the world that his parents lived in. So it was enormously influential in his trajectory. And then the town disappears almost as soon as he leaves. He left, in the late 1830s to move to Springfield, which was the new capital. And he was a state legislator, and he moved, he set up a law office there with a partner. And by the early 1840s, New Salem ceases to exist. But for that brief moment, it was almost like his spring training camp. It was a remarkable thing.
South Carolina's economy is growing, bringing new businesses and opportunities. The need for electricity is growing too. At Duke Energy, we're meeting the challenge, providing even more electricity that's reliable, that stays affordable. To do this, we're investing in our communities with a diverse, balanced mix of energy sources and making targeted upgrades to the grid so that South Carolina can thrive in a smarter energy future. Paid for by Duke Energy shareholders.
16 years from today, Greg Gerstner will finally land the perfect cannonball. Epic splash. Unsuspecting friends. A work of art only possible because Greg is already meeting all these same people at AARP volunteer and community events that keep him active and involved and help make sure his happiness lives as long as he does. That's why the younger you are, the more you need AARP. Learn more at aarp.org/local.
It was in New Salem, you tell readers, that he began to read partisan newspapers, driving his development into an ardent and outspoken Whig. What did it mean to be a Whig at Lincoln's time?
Well, the Whig Party was this sort of like big coalition that originally formed primarily in opposition to Andrew Jackson's presidency, and they were sort of appalled by the militarism of it, the treatment of Native Americans, the expansionist aspirations of the Democratic Party, and they were mostly, they called themselves the Whigs, fashioned after the English Whig opposition party, because they really, in the same way that English Whigs were effectively opposed to the overexercise of royal and executive authority, they also viewed Andrew Jackson as somebody who was far outreaching or overreaching the constitutional scope of his authority. But there was a coherence to what they liked. The historians used to say Democrats wanted to expand the United States over space, meaning they wanted to take the U.S. from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast and all the way down to Mexico, whereas Whigs wanted to expand it over time. And what they meant by that is that Whigs really believed in investing in material progress. So they were big supporters of what was then called internal improvements, which today we would call infrastructure. So it was infrastructure week for the Whigs. Every week they liked to build roads and railroads and bridges. They liked to open up new markets and create opportunities for people to participate in a market economy. They were fervent supporters of nascent public education and just education in general. They believed that America was in a state of forward social progress. And they tended, although there was at that point no clean division religiously in political life, that they were sort of called the Christian Party or fashioned themselves as the Christian Party because they tended to be heavily engaged in social reform movements, everything from, again, public education to temperance to Sabbatarianism in some cases. And they supported an active role for Protestant religion in public life in as much as it informed morality and priorities. So it was, for somebody like Lincoln, who wanted to make this transition from a subsistence world, subsistence farming, to becoming a white-collar professional, as we might call it today, in a new market economy, it made a lot of sense for him to gravitate to that. And he was an ardent Whig. He was a Whig till the end, and in fact, he was pretty late in acknowledging that the Whig Party had died by 1854. He was late in becoming a Republican, relatively speaking.
While Lincoln is developing, there is a great religious revival sweeping the country. We now call it the Second Great Awakening. Tell me about the brand of Christianity that was becoming so popular and why it was becoming so popular.
So it's hard to generalize, and one shouldn't, but if we're going to, so we will. The Second Great Awakening draws millions of Americans, North and South, to either new churches or older churches that are kind of reinventing themselves. And there are a couple of broadly speaking, a couple of strains to this. These churches tend to emphasize the agency of the individual in deciding to become a Christian, accept Christ into his or her life, and secure salvation in the next world, which is quite a bit different from the Calvinism that many Northerners that had grown up with, or that somebody like Lincoln had grown up with, where there was a real predestinarian type of strain to those churches, particularly Presbyterian, Baptist, and Congregationalist churches. So that changes, and people come to believe that they have a great deal of personal agency in securing their own salvation and election. I think second, there's a feeling that one can have a really personal relationship with Christ. I'm Jewish, so I'm speaking in fairly broad terms, and I always preface by saying that I think a lot of my Christian friends and Christian readers probably have a stronger grasp on how to explain this, but I think than I do intuitively. But there was a sense, particularly among say old school Presbyterians or Calvinists within the Baptist and Presbyterian movements, that God was a sort of distant and unknowable God. For evangelicals, there was a personal relationship with Christ that was deeply felt. And I think the third thing is it's a hyper-democratic type of movement, and I mean that in a couple of ways. So remember that this is all happening as the country is also transitioning from being fairly elite-led, an elite-led republic, basically, in the 1780s and 90s, to a hyper-democratic society by the 1820s and 30s, both on an economic and politics small p level. And just as you're getting a heightened competition between political parties, which didn't exist in the 1790s in any real fashion, you're also getting competition between these new rising denominations. And so the Baptists, Methodists, New School Presbyterians, Disciples of Christ, and tons of other offshoot denominations, and even denominations within denominations or movements within denominations, so different movements within the Baptist and Presbyterian churches, they're competing to fill pews. They are trying to capture this incredible religious sensibility. They're staging revivals and prayer meetings and trying to draw people to their own churches. So you're getting like literal democratic competition for churchgoers, but you're also getting doctrinal democratization, where people both can shop for the type of denomination that appeals to them, and these churches and these evangelical churches are also adjusting the theology to meet popular sentiment. And this is a world in which people want to feel control. Like, this is a rising democracy and a rising market economy. And at the same time, you're getting the democratization of the churches. And European visitors to the US often noted that these things were happening at the same time. They couldn't quite get their head around it. Like, what did it all mean in a coherent way? But you're getting a democratization of politics, democratization of the economy, and a democratization of churches. And it's all happening at the same time.
One statistic that stood out to me from this section: when Lincoln was born, there were 46 urban areas in the United States, and by 1860, when he was elected, 400 urban areas. So the pace of growth and change was just something we can almost not comprehend today. I would just remind people that urban meant about 2,500 people, but it was still urban.
So
yeah, right.
It was urban. Like, listen, if you've ever lived in a farming community or in a really rural area where you're not anywhere near your neighbors, and then you move to a small town with 2,500 people, it's a difference.
What did Lincoln think of this expanding evangelical movement?
He was pretty indifferent to it for the greater part of his young adulthood. There is no evidence that he ever. Well, I mean, there's evidence to the contrary. He purportedly was a religious scoffer and a fairly open one in the 1830s, And so much so that his friends were really concerned that this was going to hurt his political career. He purportedly had written a tract, a kind of irreligious tract, attempting to disprove the divinity of Christ. Whether that happened or not is an open question. We'll never know. But these rumors dogged him in his first race for the state legislature in the 1830s, and they dogged him in his race for Congress in 1846, when it was his sort of bizarre misfortune as somebody who really marched to the beat of his own drum and was not religious. It was his bizarre misfortune that his opponent that year was Peter Cartwright, a Democratic nominee and former state legislator, who also happened to be a Methodist minister and one of the most renowned circuit riders in the Midwest. And it was a problem for Lincoln that he was seen as a religious scoffer. And so he learned to be fairly tight-lipped about this. And we know that as late as 1858, the local Presbyterian minister in Springfield, Illinois, or one of the Presbyterian ministers in Springfield, who was the minister at the church where the Lincolns rented a pew, mostly in deference to Mary Todd Lincoln, he attempted to convert Lincoln. He would later say that he managed to do it, but one of Lincoln's friends said that the minister tried and just couldn't. And there's nothing in the public record or private record to suggest that Lincoln had any real sense of religiosity before he went to Washington as president.
We're at the halfway point of our conversation about Lincoln's God with author Josh Zeitz. Josh, let me ask you, we're going to fast forward. You mentioned 1858, and that was the year that Lincoln really catapulted to national attention with his failed Senate bid against Stephen A. Douglas. You say that by this point, regarding the slavery question, he was a man on fire, a very different sort of politician from the one he had formerly been. So how did he approach the question in his campaigning for office in 1858? And how did that continue to develop as he sought the presidency?
So it's interesting. Lincoln came home from his one term in Congress in 1849, and he was a sort of washed-up politician. His term in Congress had been fairly unsuccessful. He didn't run for re-election because there was an agreement among Whigs in that district. They would rotate, but he probably wouldn't have been reelected had he won. And he basically retired from politics for 5 years, and then he is reawakened in 1854 by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively abrogated the old Missouri Compromise and opened northern territories to slavery. And he was what you would call a single-issue politician. He had lots of ideas about lots of things, and he was very Whiggish in his politics, but he was mostly animated by his opposition to slavery. And what makes him so interesting and different from many of his new colleagues in the newly formed Republican Party, which was founded in opposition to slavery, is that he comes at it from a sort of from a natural rights and economic point of view. He's deeply offended by slavery. He finds it repugnant. He's personally offended by it, but it's not driven by any religious conviction because he had almost no religious conviction at this point. And whereas for other people like Salmon P. Chase or Joshua Giddings, really hardcore anti-slavery politicians who are coming at this from a deep sense of religious offense, for him, slavery is a sin. It's a sin in the sense that it denies people their natural rights. It denies people their economic rights. He's really offended that people are being pressed into labor and not being able to enjoy the fruits of that labor, and that they're denied their basic, what you would call sort of almost like the types of rights that natural rights that Thomas Paine might have described. But there's no sense of religious outrage in the way that other Republicans brought to the debate.
If you were to read the texts of the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates, how many times would he have invoked God?
2 or 3 times, 4 or 5 times, and he's not really invoking God. In a couple places, he talks about the way in which the slavery issue has rent the churches in two, because the major Protestant denominations, Baptists, Presbyterians, and Methodists, had broke into southern and northern branches in the 1840s. And so he talks about the way in which slavery is degrading all institutions, including religious institutions. And he'll occasionally throw in a reference to God, but it's in passing. It's not even a minor theme in those debates for him.
So 2 years later, as he was selling himself to a national audience, Did it change?
It starts to change. Not during the campaign, and there was an unspoken rule, which Stephen Douglas actually violated, because he and Douglas found themselves running against each other for president in 1860 again. But other than Stephen Douglas, most candidates then viewed it as not the done thing to campaign once they had been nominated. So Lincoln didn't say anything publicly during the campaign. But there's this period, about 10 or 12 days or so, after he leaves Springfield en route to D.C. to assume the presidency in February, March of 1861, he stops and gives speeches in quite a few northern cities and towns. Some were more formal than others, but you see references to the Almighty creeping into these speeches, and references to sort of divine will and what's expected of him and the nation in this moment, this moment of real tension. And there's the famous speech he gives before boarding the train in Springfield to his neighbors, where it's a farewell, and that one has some fairly religious overtones, and it's really sentimental, because he viewed Sangamon County as the place that had really made him who he was, and he was bidding farewell to these people. But you begin to see it then, and we can't really tell whether that was meant as a nod to people's religious sensibilities, or whether it was a feeling that was swelling up in him. It's hard to say, but it's really the first moment when you see him start to invoke religious language and themes in his public speeches.
So he's elected, the southern states secede, the first shots are fired at Fort Sumter, and the Civil War is on for the rest of his presidency. You say that the war became a real turning point for the churches themselves. It opened the door to reformation of the American experiment. What are you telling us there?
Yeah, the churches, the evangelical Protestant churches had always, or have for quite some time, for decades, had viewed, I think I said this, America as sort of God's new Canaan. And they viewed it as their mission to help kind of establish 1,000 years of peace that would precede Christ's second coming. Some people probably thought this was a literal mission, and others probably thought that it was more metaphorical, but they believed that they had a role to play in fulfilling that providential destiny and mission for the United States. And the war both offends that mission, because they view secession as being, a slap in the face to that providential mission, but they also come to view it as a opportunity to cleanse the country of some of its original sins. And obviously the one that they focus on intently is slavery. And so while the churches themselves had been in tension over slavery before the war, although it became easier for them to be more pronounced in their anti-slavery view after the Southern churches split off, because they no longer had to accommodate their Southern churchgoers, co-religionists. The war itself really catalyzes a movement within the major evangelical churches to embrace emancipation as an aim and outcome of the war. And the churches kind of get there way sooner than they get there sooner than the politicians. And then they try to push the politicians in that direction.
And their congregants.
I mean, church leaders were particularly outspoken. But increasingly, church laity also comes to embrace it. Now, it creates a fair amount of tension, particularly in the lower Midwest, where there were a lot of churchgoers who had deep kinship ties and personal and business ties to the South. And so while they might be ardent Unionists, many of them deeply resented the idea that they were fighting a war to emancipate slaves, and they deeply resented the fact that their ministers and lay leaders were framing the war as an emancipation war. But it's pretty clear that they were, while a very vocal and probably not insignificant minority, they were a minority.
And you describe Lincoln as well as trying to walk this fine line or thread the needle on slavery as an outcome of the war, a particular outcome during the first 2 years. If not then, what would he describe as its objectives during the first 2 years of the war?
Well, first of all, I would say first year and a half, right? Because there's this incredible turning point in barely a year and a half, less than a year and a half, because he signs the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, and he had it in his desk for 2 or 3 months before that, and had already been sort of pressure testing the idea. So really a year into the war, he's already gotten to the point where he understands that that slavery has to go if this war continues. But what gets him there? At first, he understands he's in this very tight position. He's got border states, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri. Those are slaveholding states. It's very tentative. It's really tentative that they stayed in the Union. He had to do some pretty extra legal things to keep Maryland in the Union. Kentucky was sort of, for the first part of the war, he kind of had to leave it alone and not even try to put federal troops there or impose any sort of federal presence there. So he's desperately invested in making sure that those 4 states don't secede. And it would have been consequential because they had more industrial and economic capacity than some of the states in the Deep South that had left. So he's got to do that. He's got to keep Democrats in the North who are fairly pro-slavery, but pro-union as well. He's got to keep them invested in the war effort. And so he can't move too far. But on the other hand, the base of his own party and then the churches are moving rapidly in the direction of wanting to make emancipation a war aim. And so his first measure to sort of move this along, and really like events moved faster than he did, and in some ways they had to. But he frames the Emancipation Proclamation as a sort of war measure, right? It does fundamentally change what the outcome of the war will be if the North wins, but he frames it as something that the North can and should do, and that he has authority to do in furtherance of prosecuting the war, because slaves constitute or enslaved people constitute a vital economic and military resource to the South. And so his point is, I can free them if I need to do so to win the war. But that's a position that quickly evolves in 1863. And by mid-1863, he's describing this as an emancipation war. And it's not just a necessity, it's a matter of justice in a sense.
At Mayo Clinic in Florida, we're conquering the unconquerable. Using artificial intelligence and data, our experts can create a personalized gene roadmap just for you, customizing your cancer treatment, giving your body exactly what it needs to fight the disease. We're making more possible at Mayo Clinic, because every day we're doing what's never been done. Learn more at mayoclinic.org/possible. Mayo Clinic. You know where to go.
The date, February 20th, 1862, was a turning point, you write about, for Abraham Lincoln. What happened on that day?
Well, his son, Willie, died. Willie was there. They had 3 sons at that point. One son had died as a really young boy back in Springfield. Willie got sick. He got typhoid, and he passed away in the White House. And it was crushing to the Lincolns. It was just devastating. And they were deeply, deeply attached to him and to his brother. And look, his interior life is very difficult to access because he left very little personal record. And so you have to go by what people remembered in the moment. And those memories could be imperfect or self-motivated years after the fact. But it's very clear that it had a deep impact on both of them. And I think, based on the research, it's pretty clear, and Mary would later say the same, that it led him to rethink some of his ideas and thoughts about religion.
You say that during this time period, Lincoln began to see himself as an instrument of God in prosecuting the war. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we know he's becoming, in some ways, more spiritual and more religious in 1862 and 1863. We see it in his writings, in his public papers. We see it reflected in the memories of people who were around him, both family members, including his wife, and friends and colleagues. But we also know from his own writings and conversations he had with other people, which they remembered after the fact, that he's coming to believe not only that there is a God, although his God is way less personal than the traditional evangelical conception of God and Christ. And it's, his God is more unknowable and more distant. But he comes to believe that this whole war has been preordained, which was not an uncommon position. Many of the church leaders and religious leaders felt that this was a divinely inspired and ordained war. But he also comes to believe that he's been chosen to play this role in it and to preside over it. And, I think for him, in part, this is a way for him to come to grasps with the the unspeakable carnage that he's been asked to preside over. He's the one asking everybody to pay this incredible butcher's bill. And so he comes to think of this as a role that he's been specially chosen to play. And it's interesting when he talked about his cousin Sophie's remark that Abe always had a sense that he was going to be someone. Well, he was now someone. And I think that the weight of that wore down on him pretty heavy. And this became one of his ways to reconcile it. But while so many of his evangelical, co-religionists viewed the war as something that they believed that, the Union was on God's side and God was on the Union's side, Lincoln was never quite as certain which side God wanted to win the war, if either. And he wasn't really entirely certain what he knew he thought he was God's instrument, and he said it, but he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. And so he tried to, he had the burden of someone who felt that he had been chosen to do something, but that his God was distant and unknowable, so it was difficult to understand precisely what that was supposed to be.
An interesting sidebar history to the story of Lincoln and to the growing political potency of the evangelical churches are the soldiers themselves. In a chapter called The Soldiers' War, you talk about the increasing religiosity of the 2 million Union troops who fought during the war. What was happening with the troops?
This is happening north and south, by the way. This book is looking at the north, but it's happening on both sides. And you're seeing, a massive upswing in religious revivals and tent meetings and worship meetings. You're seeing soldiers who had previously not felt themselves converting and, pledging themselves to Christ. So you unsurprisingly find that many soldiers are gravitating to Christianity in this period. Now, not to overstate the point, there were plenty of people as well who remained skeptics. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was almost killed 4 times in battle. He would later become the Supreme Court justice, but he was a lifelong skeptic, and he was dying at Antietam. He obviously lived, but he thought he was dying, and he was. And he said after the fact that he thought for a hot second about converting and accepting Christ, and then he realized that would be the height of hypocrisy because it wasn't even deeply felt. So not everyone, but for many, many soldiers, religion becomes not just a cause of comfort, but like the prism through which they understand this war and their role in it. For viewers who enjoyed Ken Burns's series, The Civil War, which is a bit dated now, but a lot of people grew up on it, one of the pull-through voices there is Elijah Hunt Rhodes, who was a soldier, a deeply pious soldier from Rhode Island, and his diary is famous. And one of the last lines in his diary says, and again I'm paraphrasing, but it basically says, I thank God that I was able to, fight this war, help save my country, and help free the slaves. And for him, it was all sort of a piece, right? There was a religious mission here to save the Union and eradicate slavery.
So advancing to the 1864 election, in which the troops overwhelmingly supported Lincoln, he faced General George McClellan, whom he had fired in the early days of the war. You described that election as the most vicious and racially charged election in American history. What was it being fought over by that point?
The Democratic Party at that point, for the Democratic Party, the war had been fought to. It was trying to do this in a politic way. At that point, the country was deeply divided. The North was deeply divided, but more like on a 60-40 basis. Democrats, either, if you were a peace Democrat or a Copperhead, you wanted to end this war, super peace, either let the South go its own way with its slaves intact or come back with slavery intact. And even many war Democrats deeply resented the fact that the war had been refashioned into a war for emancipation rather than a war to save the Union. And it was a deeply racist campaign. The campaign that the Democrats ran against Abraham Lincoln was probably, with maybe the possible exception of 1868, but it was probably the most racially vicious campaign ever waged for the presidency in the U.S. Imagine George Wallace to the 100th degree. It was that bad. And Lincoln would later note to John Hay, his aide, that it was a really weird thing that, he regarded himself as a pretty easygoing and mellow guy. And he said it's a sort of singular thing that despite that, the fact that I'm not a particularly controversial person, or that I don't court controversy or acrimony, that every campaign I've been involved in, except for my first election to Congress, has been marked by this kind of real acid tone and viciousness. And I think he really disliked it.
By this point in time, the growth of the churches, their increasing politicization, we talked a little bit about this, but was the 1864 election very much involved religion in the country as well?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Lincoln was very astute. I think that his spiritual journey is heartfelt, and although he does not by any means sort of become a standard evangelical Christian, there's a deep felt sense of spirituality to him by 1864, but he is also astutely and avidly courting the support of church leaders, lay and religious, and church organizations and bodies. He really is the first president ever to court the evangelical vote, and he's doing it because he understands the power of those churches and those church leaders. He understands the influence that they wield, and it pays dividends, because the churches, by and large, the Protestant churches, fell behind the Republican Party in 1864 in a way they had never done before. And it sounds great, right? And you can sort of get behind that in the sense that, you know, they want to win this war and eradicate slavery. But it also sets what some people today might regard as a sort of uncomfortable and maybe even inappropriate precedent, because you had church leaders on the stump, you know, for Lincoln in 1864. Matthew Simpson, one of the really important bishops in the Methodist Episcopalian Church, one of the so-called war bishops in the Methodist Church, you know, he gives this huge, rousing speech on the eve of the campaign, or on the eve of the election in New York. It's a sermon, but he calls it the war sermon, and he waves a bloody flag and openly calls on his congregants to vote for the rail splitter president. You know, this is the first time in American history when church leaders actively involve themselves on behalf of one political party and one candidate, and it had never happened before.
His second inaugural, one of perhaps the most quoted pieces of political rhetoric, March 4th, 1865. What's your interpretation of those 701 words?
It's a fascinating document. It's the second or third shortest inaugural address that any president then or since has given. Frederick Douglass, who was in the crowd that day in the audience, said that it sounded more like a sermon than a state paper. And it's deeply religious. He's invoking religious themes. He's quoting directly from the Bible. He's paraphrasing from the Bible. He's adopting the sounds and cadences of the King James Bible that was then widely in use, which sounded very Elizabethan and Shakespearean because it was of the same era. And unlike most Americans who were Protestants and deeply believed that the war was, or Northerners believed that the war was a righteous cause and divinely ordained, and they were on God's side, God was on their side, Lincoln effectively says this war was divine retribution on the entire nation, North and South, for the sin of slavery, because the North had been, complicit in that sin. And he said that it was really unclear what God willed, but that, we remember that speech for the sort of uplifting part where he talks about, what reunification could mean after the war was over and binding up the nation's wounds. But it's easy to overlook the part where he's really ripping directly from the King James Bible and promises that if the war continues, every lash of blood, every drop of blood drawn by the lash, by the slave owner's lash, will be met with blood drawn by the sword. And he effectively is saying that I have no idea how God intends this war to shake out, but I understand my role in it, and it could very well mean that there will be a lot more blood lost. So it's a very Old Testament type of sermon, and it's remarkable. And I don't think any president since has given such a deeply religious public address, and certainly not an inaugural address.
Less than 6 weeks later, he was felled by an assassin's bullet. And the fact that it happened on Good Friday had tremendous spiritual import for the country. How did they respond? How did citizens respond?
I mean, imagine that you've just gone through 4 years of events that seem biblical in nature and proportion and import, and your ministers have been telling you that they are for 4 years, because really that's how people understood these events going on around them, and they seem very Old Testament. And then this leader who was emancipated, or I would argue that slaves played the predominant role in emancipating themselves, but on paper at least, like Lincoln, has presided over the emancipation of 4 million enslaved people. And then suddenly he's shot to death on Good Friday. He's reimagined immediately as a Christ-like figure. And so just imagine those churches that Easter Sunday that were just teeming with mourners and religious celebrants. And it seemed to be, it just reinforced people's sense that they were living in historic times, meaning biblically historic times. And it led to a tendency to try to apotheosize Lincoln in his death and make him into a more pious and religious person than he had been in his life.
The churches discovered that they had the ability to move the country and had some serious political clout. How long did that become a guiding force for evangelical churches?
Well, I would argue that it's still a guiding force today, but we can certainly see it. Today, the term evangelical, for a lot of people, for the public, means something a little more narrow than it meant then, or may mean to a lot of religious Christians today. I mean, when we talk about evangelical in the late 19th century, we're talking about, what today we might call mainline denominations, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, Disciples of Christ. And in the late 19th century, certainly they became, they persisted in this comfort level with bringing their religion into the public sphere. And that could take different directions, right? In the late 19th century, that could result in, say, some of the anti-vice movements that religious Christians were deeply involved in, anti-pornography, anti-birth control, Anthony Comstock, Francis Willard, and the temperance movement. Those were really socially coercive, but many evangelicals believed that they could and should involve themselves in electoral politics in order to enforce their particular view of Christian morality on the broader country. And that put them up against a rising generation of Jewish and Catholic immigrants, many of whom held different ideas about things like alcohol. But at the same time, you could also see that on the left, the social gospel movement within the Protestant churches in the late 19th, early 20th century was deeply involved in progressive politics and in causes like labor reform, health and safety, women's rights, children's rights in the workplace. And so you could see Christians both on the left and right way more comfortable by the late 19th century involving themselves in electoral politics as Christians on behalf of their churches than would have been the case before the war. And I'd argue that's an enduring legacy of the way that the war impacted the churches. One thing that I try to talk about in this book is that, Christianity and religion generally was a real important prism and framework that people applied in understanding the war, making sense of it, and trying to reconcile themselves to the cost they had to pay during it. But at the same time, that the religion was an important element of the war. The war also influenced religion and changed the way that American Christianity operated on both an organizational and theological level.
And how about for national politicians?
Well, you never again could ignore the churches. I mean, I think that there was a recognition, after the Civil War, that the churches themselves were powerful institutions that did not exist apart from politics, and that you had to regard them as an important constituency that you courted and whose concerns you took seriously, which obviously persists today. And again, that crosses a lot of lines. So it's not just true of evangelical Christians today.
Sure, but it also stands in contrast to the concept of separation of church and state.
It does. There's a tension there, right? And you can see during the war that the churches were enormously influential in moving the North toward emancipation as a war aim and outcome. And that's a pretty rich heritage. And you fast forward 100 years, the mainline Christian churches in the 1960s, white and black, were enormously influential in pushing the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 through Congress. Joe Rao, who was a famous labor leader and who was leading lobbying efforts on behalf of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, would later observe that as he was walking through the Capitol that spring, lobbying members of Congress and senators, that you could barely turn the corner without running into somebody with a collar. So the churches have, there's a tension, right? Like it can be a pretty righteous thing when the churches involve themselves in politics on behalf of a cause that people can broadly support or get behind. But then it can also have the opposite effect, where it breaks through that line in ways that should cause people discomfort. So how to get that balance right is the eternal question. So
last question, and we only have about a minute left. You are comfortable declaring, even though he never became a churchgoer, Abraham Lincoln was the nation's first evangelical president?
I don't think he was ever evangelical in his personal belief. I think he was probably, if anything, closer to being a Unitarian. But I use the phrase sort of in a broader sense, in that I think he was the first president to channel the enthusiasm and the influence of the evangelical churches to fold the language that evangelicals used and the framework by which they understood the world into his public speeches and proclamations, to meet them where they were and to help them use their faith to understand what the nation needed of them. So in that sense, I think he was, he did what he did 150 years before George W. Bush arguably became the first president to do it in a way that also resonated with him personally. I don't think he was ever personally an evangelical Christian, but I think that he understood the power of evangelical Protestantism as a motivating force, as a way for people to make order of the world, and he leaned in heavily on it.
And I'm sure all of this study informs your coverage of politics today as well.
It's hard not to see the parallels today.
Well, that's it for our time. Josh Zeitz is the author of a new book about Abraham Lincoln called Lincoln's God: How Faith Transformed a President and a Nation. Thanks so much for spending an hour with C-SPAN.
Hey, thank you. It was a great pleasure.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Q&A. Remember, if you subscribe to this podcast, you'll never miss an episode. And I'd really like to hear from you about our interviews. You can email me at podcast, that's podcast with an S, at c-span.org. Your feedback is welcome.